Hi, hello. My name is Crystal, and this is Horror Nights In, where we love horror movies. So let's talk about a horror movie. In this video, we're going to be talking about the 1999 film Teaching Mrs. Tingle. Considering the 1990s was a decade filled with self-aware teens getting stalked and slaughtered by mass killers, it's no surprise that Teaching Mrs. Tingle was written and directed by Kevin Williamson in his directorial debut. Williamson, fresh off the success of Scream in 1996, Scream 2 in 1997, I Know What You Did Last Summer, also in 1997, and The Faculty in 1998, which I'll be covering in my next video, Williamson pulled together a star-studded cast to pull off a revenge fantasy he had about his high school English teacher who told him he would never be a writer. Teaching Mrs. Tingle was the first script Williamson ever wrote, and he wrote it right before Scream. He first brought it to Interscope, but they argued that kids weren't that self-aware. But when he brought it to Miramax, they understood it right away. I also love how we get to see this actress, Melissa Jarrett Winokur, known as the garage victim in the 2000 film Scary Movie. She had no lines in Teaching Mrs. Tingle, but her scene in Scary Movie was iconic, just like her line for being a day player, which in the film world means a minor character who shoots their same scenes and goes home. Armed with Helen Mirren as the evil and manipulative history teacher, Mrs. Tingle, the film did some things great and some things not so great. Instilling fear in her students with her power and intelligence, Mrs. Tingle had the entire school, including a recovering or not so recovering alcoholic principal by the throats, ruling the school and her classroom with an iron fist. Helen Mirren revealed in an interview that her sister, who was a teacher, didn't approve of her taking on the role and didn't speak to her for quite some time. Mirren believes that there are teachers out there like Mrs. Tingle and countered her perspective, saying that there are plenty of movies about good teachers, so there can be one about a horrible teacher too. She also revealed that when Williamson presented her with the idea of playing the part of Mrs. Tingle, she was intrigued because of the dark comedic approach she took with it. Playing off fear of dim futures, her students worked hard to earn an A, more so Leanne Watson, played by Katie Holmes, an honors student only a few percentage points shy of becoming class valedictorian. Her competition was a button-upped brown-noser named Trudy Tucker, played by Liz Stauber, who took every chance she could to shove GPAs down Leanne's throat. Vivica A. Fox, who played Leanne's guidance counselor, Miss Gold, also added layers in to Trudy's very nasty character by confiding in Leanne that Trudy is a Harvard Trust Fund twit whose good grades are just a result of good ass kissing. I do wish that we had seen more of Fox's character in the film though. As any main character in a Williamson film, she needs her spunky and dramatic best friend. JoLynn Jordan, played by Marissa Coughlan, was the Tatum to her Sydney or the Helen to her Julie. JoLynn was Leanne's biggest fan other than her own mother, who worked double shifts at a diner to help pay the bills. Getting an A and securing her place as valedictorian was the only way Leanne would be able to get into college and live out her dream of becoming a writer. JoLynn, on the other hand, wanted to run off to Hollywood to become an actress. Also in the mix was the bad boy and charmer Luke Cherner, played by Barry Watson, who was destined to become nothing, just like his father, according to Mrs. Tingle, who had apparently taught his father many years ago. Barry Watson was also in a season of filming Seventh Heaven when he starred in this film. Another familiar face in this cast is that of Molly Ringwald. She had a smaller role playing an office assistant turned substitute teacher for Mrs. Tingle. Ringwald said that watching Katie Holmes on set reminded her much of herself when she was younger on the set of 16 Candles. Another thing to note is that JoLynn had a big old crush on Luke, but Luke wasn't interested in her. He was interested in her best friend. Wonder how that will play out later in the film. Both Holmes and Watson agreed that having Helen Mirren in the role of Mrs. Tingle was the perfect addition to the film, and they couldn't imagine the film without her. Mirren also expressed how her younger co-stars were technically experienced with working on a set and very supportive of each other. The film starts off with Leanne presenting her class project, a leather-bound journal from the point of view of a Salem witch who was burned at the stake. The journal took Leanne months as she crafted it with quill and ink and burnt the pages to mimic it being from another time. Mrs. Tingle takes one look at the first page and berates and mocks her before slamming the journal on her desk, calling on the next student. In addition to Leanne's project, another student who wants to be a cop decides to build his own crossbow, which doesn't bode well with anyone when he accidentally shoots it towards the class and almost takes out Trudy Tucker's eye, but she is saved by a nicely placed yearbook. Most of the actors on set had never used a crossbow before, and this one was built just for the film and had 3 different sizes until they decided on which one that fit best for everyone. Considering the crossbow becomes the weapon of choice throughout the entire film, you'd think she'd maybe take it to the office to lock it up, but instead she takes it home with her. I have to make mention here that I do think Mrs. Tingle was impressed by Leanne's project, but for whatever reason she decides to chastise it instead. There was never any reason mentioned as to why Mrs. Tingle hated students or people in general, but maybe in Leanne's case it's because she was young and pretty. There were some hints throughout the film that she wanted her students to learn, but her approach was suspicious. Another reason could also be Mrs. Tingle was miserable because she never got out of the small town, and seeing her students, who might have a different outcome, made her jealous. Or she just resented them all for being selfish and entitled. The catalyst that puts the entire film into motion is when Mrs. Tingle catches the 3 students in a gym with a copy of her final exam inside Leanne's book bag that was put there by Luke in an offering to help her get the A that she wants. With the expulsion for cheating lingering in her future, Jolene insists she can make it right by having a conversation with the teacher. The 3 then go to Mrs. Tingle's home later that night, which is odd that they know where their teacher lives. I never knew where any of my teachers lived. After a lackluster story of a dying mother from Jolene, Mrs. Tingle tells her that she will make a horrible actress and slams the door in her face. It's now Leanne's turn, and she asks to be let in, to which Miss Tingle allows, and they have a nice conversation. And all is well. Not. Leanne is now joined by Jolene and Luke, and now they are trying to reason with her, but things go from bad to worse when Jolene shoots the crossbow at Mrs. Tingle, slicing open the side of her head and knocking her out. They then decide their best course of action is to tie their history teacher to her bed, exorcist style. Speaking of The Exorcist, we got a pretty decent scene from actress Marissa Coughlan doing her best take on the iconic scene of the possessed Reagan from the 1973 film. And the rest of the film plays out the back and forth of the students trying to figure out what to do to get themselves out of the situation they got themselves into. Helen Mirren said in an interview that she loved being able to star in a film where she got to lay in bed almost the entire time. Mrs. Tingle is a master manipulator and doesn't need to try very hard to get these teens into their feels, especially Jolene, poking at how Luke only has eyes for her best friend. It plays off in Mrs. Tingle's favor when Coach Winchell, played by Jeffrey Tombs, comes to visit Mrs. Tingle, with whom he is having an affair with. After blindfolding the coach and getting him very drunk, they stage illicit photos of him with Mrs. Tingle as blackmail. Another thing I also want to make mention of is, did these teens really think that they were going to get away with this blackmail? Mrs. Tingle had a head wound that was still bleeding, she was tied up, and the coach was clearly passed out. But then I remembered that they're teens who were desperate not to get in trouble. Telling Jolene to stay with Mrs. Tingle, Luke and Leanne dump the coach at home. Once again, how do they know where all their teachers live? While doing so, Mrs. Tingle pushes the narrative of Luke and Leanne being together behind Jolene's back. Eventually, this sets Jolene into a spiral, and she abandons ship and ignores any communication from Leanne. To make matters worse, Leanne does decide to sleep with Luke after Mrs. Tingle basically calls her out for being scared of ending up like her mother. Putting that scene into perspective was wild. The teacher, being in her late 50s, basically trying to rip down a 17-year-old girl in such a mean, cruel manner really stung, but then again, she is being held captive. After changing her grade in Mrs. Tingle's gradebook from a C to an A and changing Trudy's grade from an A to a B, Leanne drops off the gradebook in the guidance counselor's office. The grades are then posted, and Trudy is off her rocker by seeing that she got a B, because she's never gotten a B. She only gets A's. In the climax of the film, while Luke and Leanne were in their teenage love bliss, Mrs. Tingle is able to get herself out of her restraints and hits Luke over the head off screen the next morning. Mrs. Tingle also calls the school to tell them that her gradebook was stolen and that grades were altered. In one last showdown, Mrs. Tingle, armed with a crossbow, tells Leanne that she has called the principal and he is on his way over, but with some good acting on Jolene's part, she's able to fool the teacher into thinking she is on her side and then pushes the teacher to the ground. The cat and mouse game continues with Mrs. Tingle bashing Leanne's head into a wall and Jolene throwing Mrs. Tingle down the stairs. Mrs. Tingle then loads up the crossbow, aims it at Leanne but misses and hits Trudy instead, who has arrived at the home of her teacher to ask her why she got a B and not an A. The principal arrives and Leanne tells Mrs. Tingle that Trudy is dead and to tell the principal what happened. But jump scare, Trudy is alive and is saved by her yearbook yet again, and the film ends with Leanne getting her scholarship. After I watched the film again for this video, I wondered how Jolene was able to forgive her best friend so easily for sleeping with her crush. But then I remembered that they were teenagers, and they basically beat kidnapping and assault charges, so things could be worse, I guess. I do wonder what came of Mrs. Tingle, though. She was obviously fired by the principal at the end of the film after shooting the crossbow at Trudy. Speaking of Trudy, what happened to her? I suppose it really doesn't matter, but considering Luke, Leanne, and Jolene held Mrs. Tingle captive and then changed their grades, how did Leanne end up still getting her scholarship? Either way, the film is very far from perfect, but considering it's on Kevin Williams' roster, it's definitely worth a watch. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.